Abraham Reyes was never a revolutionary. Arguably one of the most transparent, self-serving, and repulsive characters within the Red Dead franchise, Abraham Reyes was a clear-cut, narcissistic opportunist who not only took advantage of others, but essentially used practically everyone around him and the Nuevo Paraiso rebellion in order to elevate his personal standing, status, and prestige. Reyes, who was born into a wealthy family which belonged to the Mexican aristocracy, took advantage of and used the state uprising, specifically the brave men and women who joined the rebellion and risked everything, to ultimately become a brutal tyrant who rules the entire country. Reyes was an overly narcissistic, but not a complicated opportunist, who not only used the rebellion to gain power and eventually rule Mexico as a dictator, but was also a cruel womanizer who used and then completely disregarded many women for his own selfish desires and whims. Reyes certainly shares some similarities with Captain Vicente de Santa, such as his vanity, narcissism, and being a sociopath. He believes that the peasants he's fighting to liberate are inferior to him. He doesn't care one iota for the girl who is in love with him. He craves power but has absolutely no plan, let alone a revolutionary program to emancipate the marginalized. All Reyes is interested in is the glory and admiration of those he uses, and just like De Santa, Reyes is a sociopathic liar, lying to and manipulating almost everyone around him in the pursuit of power and prestige. Abraham Reyes is an overly self-absorbed, narcissistic, and vain man who possesses an exaggerated self-image or superiority complex, often overestimating his abilities and achievements. This stems from his noble birth, as Reyes grew up in an affluent family belonging to the higher classes, and specifically the aristocracy. Reyes, in fact, does not genuinely care about the marginalized and downtrodden, only providing occasional lip service to securing liberty and freedom in Mexico while glorifying himself and wallowing in his narcissism. Reyes poses as a liberator to the impoverished and oppressed of Mexico. The marginalized masses respect and admire Reyes, genuinely believing that he opposes class divisions. His young peasant girlfriend and fellow rebellion leader, Luisa, believes Reyes' promise to her that he will marry her. The reality is that Reyes has no interest in Luisa, nor any interest in marrying a peasant. He often forgets her name. Reyes also has considerable disdain for the lower classes he's claiming to fight for and attempting to emancipate. Reyes, in fact, is very similar to Colonel Agustin Allende and even Captain Vicente de Santa. Despite being such an obvious fake whose various proclamations regarding the revolution were blatantly contrived, none of the brave and downtrodden peasants and workers who joined the rebellion saw through Reyes' lies or challenged and called him out. While Reyes' disdain for the lower classes generally stems from his affluent upbringing and belonging to the aristocracy, he is also an advocate of eugenics. During this time in history, eugenics were a relatively new, but ultimately proven idiotic, idea which divided humanity's varying ethnicities into upper and lower classes. Reyes boasts that he has more noble blood than the marginalized lower classes he's leading. His superiority complex and belief in eugenics has also made him into a clear-cut bigot, as he views other ethnicities and races as inferior. Despite Reyes' poor personal traits and behavior, he does not lead the state rebellion from the rear and is not a coward. Reyes saves John's life. After John saved his life, of course, just as he's about to be executed and acts as a decoy to assist in the theft of a train while he helps John and leads the assault on Escalera. Reyes certainly is loyal to most of those who have been loyal to and fought alongside him, with certain exceptions, however, such as with John and those he's leading in the state rebellion. But most importantly, Reyes does help John in his pursuit of Javier Escuela and Bill Williamson. Abraham Reyes was born in 1881 on a ranch near Mexico City. Born into a wealthy aristocratic family, Reyes had a privileged childhood. Not only did his nursemaid feed his vanity by telling him that one day he'd be very famous, but also that Reyes was educated in both Mexico and Europe. Reyes would eventually be expelled from a school in Switzerland for having an affair with a chambermaid. Reyes spent his youth being educated in and traveling throughout Europe. At one point, Reyes was living in Madrid with the wife of the Mexican ambassador to Spain. At some point, Reyes returned to Mexico, and in 1911 found himself as one of the leaders within the Nuevo Paraiso state rebellion. Reyes convinced many peasants and workers, by lying and relying on his charisma, to join the uprising and to fight the Mexican army, overthrow the state governor, Colonel Agustin Allende, and ultimately Mexican President Ignacio Sanchez. We first meet Abraham Reyes in the mission Must a Savior Die, in which he has been captured, imprisoned, and facing execution by the Mexican army in the El Presidio fort. John has been asked by Luisa Fortuna, another rebel leader, to rescue Reyes. Luisa is visibly upset as she is in love with Abraham and tells John that despite his family's disapproval, they are planning to get married. Luisa believes the revolution will not be successful without him and asks John to help. John sneaks into El Presidio, ambushes the guards, and eventually reaches Reyes in time. When John tells Reyes that he was sent by Luisa, Reyes is confused and doesn't know who John is talking about. John then tells Reyes that Luisa, the girl he is marrying, sent him to El Presidio, to which Reyes responds by calling her a devoted thing, and unconvincingly claims that she is the love of his life. John frees Reyes, and the two men escape El Presidio on horseback. They follow a rebel guide who leads them down the coastline of the San Luis River to a small dock where Luisa is waiting. But as the two men ride off from El Presidio, Reyes asks John's name and then asks if he's the American working for Allende. John responds that he's not working for anybody and that he's here because Luisa asked for his help. Reyes then admits that he was planning on putting a bullet in your back. Reyes then asks John, "How do you know my young lover, Laura?" To which John replies, "It's Luisa. I saved her life a while not so long back." Reyes' next response to John lays bare everything repulsive and odious about his personal character and conduct. "I will not forget this, compadre. You will be rewarded. Money, women, Luisa, if you want her." Reyes just offered up his young girlfriend for sex to the man who saved his life. He was asked to save his life by his young girlfriend who loves him. Reyes knows nothing of gratitude, humility, compassion, affection, or basic moral decency. As we will see as the story unfolds, Reyes is unquestionably a total degenerate and sociopath. Reyes also boasted to John that, "I wish I could see Allende's face when he finds out I have defeated 100 of his men." No, Reyes didn't kill 100 Mexican soldiers, but this is his modus operandi, to make bold assertions and claims about his supposed accomplishments and deeds, as his narcissism and ego demands it. John, meanwhile, cleverly observes that all Reyes did was get on the back of his horse. Reyes thanks John for his help and invites John to join him at his ranch, Agave Viejo. Abraham Reyes next appears in the mission Cowards Die Many Times, John is informed by Colonel Allende that Bill Williamson and Javier Escuela have been captured and are being held by the Mexican army in Chuparosa. John then travels to Chuparosa with Captain DeSanta and is led into a trap. As John is led into the town's church where he was told that Bill and Javier are being held, John is hit and knocked out from behind. He then awakens to DeSanta taunting him and on the verge of being executed, but Abraham Reyes saves John's life by shooting the soldier who was about to kill John. So after John saves Reyes' life, just as he was about to be executed, Reyes returns the favor for John and saves his life. John, who is bound, then runs to Reyes, who cuts John free, and a massive shootout ensues. John, however, has to retrieve his weapons, which are in the center of the town, which he eventually does, then takes out several soldiers. John fights his way through the town hall, where he eventually finds and kills Captain Espinosa. The mission concludes with Reyes giving an enthusiastic speech to the rebels. John meets up with Reyes again in the mission The Great Mexican Train Robbery. Reyes asks for John's help in stealing a train from the Mexican army in order to crack a safe for supplies. Reyes assures John that he will help him in his pursuit of Bill and Javier, that he has his best men working on it. John elaborates on his history for Reyes, explaining that himself, Bill, and Javier were lost youth when they met Dutch and that he recruited them into his gang. He would rob from the wealthy and then help those who really needed it. Reyes eventually says that the people in the capital of Mexico are already talking about his legendary escape from El Presidio and that he fought off 1,000 soldiers with his bare hands. Here is a prime example of Reyes exaggerating his abilities and achievements, stroking his ego and narcissism. At one point, Reyes asks John what he thinks about Colonel Agustin Allende. John responds that he knows Allende is not a good man, and Reyes then explains that Allende is not a good man due to his cowardice, as well as Sanchez. John immediately inquires about this Sanchez, and Reyes elaborates. General Ignacio Sanchez, our country's kind and generous dictator. Everything comes from him. It is like a father who beats his son, and then the son takes his dog outside and rapes it. How do you say, a puppet? Everything he does is controlled by Sanchez. It is both interesting and ironic that Reyes would point this out for John, in a very graphic way, that he would lament Mexico's dictator, General Sanchez, when in just a few years' time, Reyes would soon find himself filling that role, despite being one of the leaders of the Nuevo Paraiso state rebellion. John and Reyes eventually arrive in Chuparosa. John sneaks to the train, dispatches the guards, takes out the rest of the soldiers, and eventually steals the train. The hatch to a particular train car is blown off, and John loots the safe for Reyes. Reyes then informs John that he will soon have the information regarding the locations of Javier and Bill, and to meet up with him again at Agave Viejo. John arrives at the Agave Viejo ranch and is clearly not impressed as he finds Reyes cheating on Luisa as he's having sex with another woman. John then immediately calls out Reyes for his odious behavior, and Reyes demonstrates just how repulsive he really is. He has no interest in Luisa. He doesn't want to marry her, and in fact would never marry a peasant due to the social stigma, as Reyes belongs to the aristocracy and is repulsed by the lower classes. In fact, when he can even remember Luisa's name, Reyes encourages John to have sex with her himself. Reyes then disparages Luisa and mocks her apparent physical shortcomings.
Let me tell you something. I strongly recommend her. You take her when you have the chance, my brother.
She thinks she's your wife.
My wife? These peasant girls, they believe every word a fellow says. So naive. The very thought that I would marry some peasant girl with a tight gun and the hands of a farmer. Well, I really don't think so. My mother, que Dios la cuide, would turn in her grave.
Interesting.
John is informed by Reyes that Javier is hiding out at El Presidio, but he is not sure about Bill. John and Reyes depart. and the rebels' plan is to assault and capture El Presidio and then move on to and assault Escalera. After riding for a while, John again brings up Luisa and Reyes' poor behavior and that he can't even remember her name. Reyes then attempts to justify his infidelities and poor conduct by further stroking his own ego.
A man like me cannot be with just one woman. It would be an injustice to the people I have devoted my life to serve.
You have an interesting way of serving the people. Kind of like a national gigolo.
That's right. According to Reyes, he cannot be with one woman or partner because it would apparently be an injustice to those he's helped throughout his entire life. Reyes is a sleazy opportunist who is only leading the rebellion so he can ultimately fulfill his own plans for power and further abuse. He's a self-serving, parasitic opportunist who only cares about himself. While John calls out Reyes as a national gigolo, he clearly isn't done and goes much further by calling out Reyes' bigotry.
What about the Chinese workers here? I hear you ain't exactly made them very welcome.
That is different. They are an inferior race.
You have all the makings of a great leader, Abraham.
While John responds to Reyes with clear sarcasm and is repulsed by Reyes, I can't help but wonder how much Arthur Morgan would have been disgusted with Reyes and probably would have much more than a sarcastic barb or two for Reyes. Nonetheless, Reyes actually slipped up and somewhat admitted to his true intentions.
The revolution is gaining momentum. Do you have any idea how many times I have thought about the day I will march into Escalera and storm Allende's mansion?
I think I have some idea.
Soon it will be me sleeping on those silk sheets and the colonel lying with the cucarachas.
Reyes says loud and clear to John that he basically wants to take over and live in Allende's mansion and sleep between his silk sheets. Reyes is admitting to what he genuinely wants and desires: to replace Colonel Agustin Allende and ultimately replace General Ignacio Sanchez. It's quite telling that Reyes has absolutely nothing to say about improving the lives of Nuevo Paraisos and Mexico's marginalized, downtrodden, and poor. Reyes has nothing to say about the emancipation of the workers and peasants, let alone agrarian reform, seizing the ownership and control of the means of production, distribution, and exchange, the redistribution of wealth, and so on. Reyes has nothing to say because he never was a revolutionary. His interests are completely foreign and alien to those he claims to represent and wants to liberate, or claims to liberate. Reyes' interests are completely foreign and alien because he belongs to a completely different social class. Reyes is the child of wealth and privilege. Anyways, John and Reyes finally arrive at El Presidio and launch the assault on the fort. While the rebels attack the side entrance of the fort as a distraction, John rides a wagon filled with dynamite into the front gate of the fort. The rebels then pour into the fort, as John immediately begins looking for Javier and tracks him down in a storage room. Javier attempts to escape, but John eventually tracks him down, apprehends him, and takes him back to El Presidio, and is imprisoned. John then helps Reyes and the rebels fight off the Mexican army's reinforcements before finally capturing the fort for good. John arrives at Escalera as the rebel assault has been underway for what appears to be for quite some time. Abraham Reyes has been captured once again by the Mexican army, and it is up to John to once again save him from execution. John confronts the soldiers who have Reyes in custody and tries to convince them to free Reyes. John draws his gun, but suddenly, from out of nowhere, Luisa appears and rushes towards the two soldiers, brandishing a knife, which seems very strange and very random, almost as though the writers were unsure of what to do. But she is shot quickly. John then kills the two soldiers and then kills their commanding officer in a duel. Reyes thanks John and tells him that some of his best men are being held in Escalera's jail. After killing the guards and freeing more rebels, they begin their assault on Colonel Allende's mansion. After a prolonged and fierce shootout, John and the rebels make their way up the hill and eventually through the gates of the mansion compound. After storming the mansion, Colonel Allende and Bill Williamson make a desperate escape on a stagecoach. John and Reyes eventually catch up to the stagecoach, and John stops it. Allende attempts to save his own life by offering up Bill to John and Reyes, but Reyes kills Allende. Bill then says he will come quietly, but tries to retrieve Allende's gun, but John easily kills Bill. Reyes' immediate reaction is quite telling.
My people are free, and it is all thanks to you, John.
And to the people who laid down their lives. People like Luisa.
Oh, yes. She was very brave, and she will be missed. Who was she again?
Your peasant girl wife-to-be?
Oh, yes, of course. She will have a day named after her. Laura's Day.
Luisa.
What? Oh, yes, I know Laura as well. Magnificent girl. Like riding a pompous bull it was, amigo. You never saw anything like it. Anyway, enough about sport.
John immediately calls out Reyes once again for his cold and callous treatment of Luisa. Not only is Reyes extremely disingenuous and barely concealing it, but also very crudely diminishing Luisa's worth as a human being to nothing more than a sexual object to be used and discarded, like riding a pampas bull. Reyes is only fighting the oppressive regime so he can replace people like Allende and Sanchez. Otherwise, if Reyes wasn't a craven, power-hungry opportunist, he would likely be a part of the regime and likely playing a significant role in it. Reyes then asks John if he will join the rebels as they continue onto the capital, but John declines as he must return to the United States. While Reyes comments that he will miss him, John cleverly points out that he doubts if Reyes will even remember him, but that if Reyes does win power, he should remember why he wanted it. Reyes did indeed eventually win, but he had no interest in emancipating the marginalized and bringing an end to tyranny and authoritarianism. Reyes wanted the power all to himself and to become both Colonel Allende and General Sanchez. He outright stated to John in the mission The Gates of El Presidio that he was going to be the next president of Mexico. This was his true goal and aspiration. Reyes somehow emerged as one of the leaders of the Nuevo Paraiso state rebellion and lied to and manipulated everyone around him. He fooled everyone into believing that he was one of them and that he would do everything he could to emancipate the downtrodden and oppressed peasants and workers, overthrow the brutal regime, and liberate the country from vicious authoritarianism. But Abraham Reyes hailed from the privileged landowning aristocracy. He belonged to a completely different social class than those he claimed to be fighting for. And for Reyes, he was extremely proud of his class and upbringing, to such an extent that it consolidated and consumed his entire identity. For Reyes, belonging to the wealthy and privileged aristocracy was a badge of honor. Reyes himself said that he could never marry a peasant, as when he's the president of Mexico, his wife will be meeting ambassadors, kings, and other great men, therefore implying that this is unworthy of a peasant. Deep down, Reyes had nothing but contempt for those he was claiming to be liberating, and this contempt would reveal itself for all to see. Just 3 years later, when President Abraham Reyes had thousands of innocent civilians massacred for merely peacefully protesting the same living conditions they endured under Colonel Allende and General Sanchez. Reyes also delayed elections and allowed people to starve to death, while having a new presidential palace built for himself, with further plans for the construction of a concert hall and other government facilities. The rebellion was nothing more than political maneuvering and a power grab for Abraham Reyes, who resumed the relentless tyranny of those before him.